Beautiful. Kia ora. Kia ora koutou katoa. Welcome to RaC Guild Townhall number 11. We're almost a year old, people. It's scary. Very scary. Nice to see. I think there's some new faces in the room, certainly that I don't know. Philippa, I'm sure you can take a note of some of those people and we can speak to them after we hear from the awesome Matti from the OpenFisca Foundation or Association?
Association now.
Association. Right. Beautiful. Awesome. Matti, it's nice to see you. It's been a while since I saw you, since we started doing that project a long time ago, the Regulation as Code project. And we were introduced to you. Really looking forward to your presentation this evening because the OpenFisca Association has come a long way since 2022, right? I'll hand it over to you and we'll do questions afterwards. Is that okay?
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Over to you.
Yeah, so let me just share my screen. And indeed, there was a rule in France for incorporating an association, which is that you shouldn't call it a foundation. So that's why it's called the OpenFisca Association and not the OpenFisca Foundation. Can everyone see my screen?
We can. Thank you.
Perfect. All right. Yes, so thanks very much for inviting me. I'm here to talk today about an advocate for open collaborations on rules as code. So I'm Matti Schneider. I'm the executive director of the OpenFisca Association. But if you call it the OpenFisca Foundation, I think everyone will still understand what you're talking about. Yeah, we had a launch event and an official incorporation celebration just 2 months ago, which was also associated with the Rules as Code Europe conference that some of you might have attended or at least heard about. It took place mid-March in Paris. There were over 60 people from 12 different countries. It was really lovely to see this rules as code movement growing, becoming more international. And of course, we talked about OpenFisca, but we talked about methodologies and we talked about tools. And one of the things that was known before, but that became very clear at that occasion, is just how many people, locations, and tools are available now for rules as code. What you're seeing there is the map of the deployment of OpenFisca, with in green countries that have a model in production, in blue the countries where there's a model that has been prototyped, and in purple the countries where we have discussions on potential adoption. And what you don't see on this map is all the other models, because actually most countries have some model of their legislation in one agency or another, because the vast majority of countries do not actually have the resources to have humans calculating every single thing, right? So there's already some computational model that's in place. And many of the richer countries have their own rules as code engine. Even when they don't really know the concept, even though they would not necessarily call it rules as code, they actually have a way to make the calculations that is not just coded computations, as most countries have, but have some declarative way to represent rules. And some of them even make some of these rules public. So most of the wealthier countries have their own engine. And some countries even have several rules as code engine competing nationally. And I deserve that award, especially to France, which is trying to support 3 different rules as code engine at the same time with different ministries and agencies, all vouching for another one on top of the existing computational engines. So this, in a way, is great, but that's called fragmentation. And what's positive about it is that there's more divergence, so there's also more ideas. There's more innovation. There are different ways to look at the same concept and offer different implementations for it, which is very positive in that it can sometimes solve problems that seemed to be intractable before. However, that innovation is most of the time short-term because funding is lost, reinventing the wheel, and there's some energy that's invested in promoting tech that is not necessarily ready, especially for the constraints of government. The rules as code concept has been around for some time. We've settled on a name about 7 years ago, finally, which made it easier to talk about this. But I still see prototype level implementations being proposed and pushed forward. And then there's quite a bit of lost opportunities, especially for adoption, because what usually happens is that governments prioritize their own national prototypes, which often end up failing, which is normal because it's tech that was prototyped, right? And they are not necessarily ready for production scale. And in each country, there's, of course, political uncertainty as well. So what usually happens, what we've seen time and again, is that a prototype emerges, there's 6 months of work that's put in, there's one use case, and 4 months in, it just gets more or less silently shut down because there's no more political support, because there's no more funding, because whatever. When this was a dedicated national engine, usually the blame is laid on the tech itself or on the rules as code concept, because no one wants to take the blame, right? No one wants to say, actually, we kind of failed because our political leader left halfway through, or because the coalition and the government changed priorities. So it's much easier to blame the tech. If we were to have a more consolidated approach, when you have one engine that has been already deployed in other places, or where you have a much stronger theoretical base, then you cannot really blame the tech anymore. So right now, this high level of fragmentation is often leaving a trail of failures that make it really hard to bring back the idea of rules as code. You kind of have to wait 2-3 years until everyone has forgotten about it and people have been replaced, and then you can try again. So one other thing that we're missing is international comparison. The fact that we have very different approaches from one country to the next makes it only possible to model within one jurisdiction. But there are many actually opportunities for international comparison, whether from one country to the next, comparing policies, or in between them. There are many interactions between comparison that could be modeled with rules as code, especially tariffs, which is a very relevant topic these days. For people watching this in replay, we're in the middle of the tariff war started by Donald Trump in January 2025. People from the future, we don't know how it ends at the moment, but for sure might be interesting to model all this and be able to adjust the percentages as fast as the American administration does. So in the end, at the current level of adoption, I believe that the costs of fragmentation strongly outweigh its benefits because of the redundant investment, which might be compounded by the increased innovation. But what worries me most is that we're putting the democratic promise of rules as code at risk. Especially considering the current geopolitical context with authoritarian governments handing over operations to profit-driven entities, there's a marked decrease in transparency and democratic intentions. I feel that the world we have now is not really the same we had 7 years ago when we settled on the name. There was a window of opportunity for rules as code that was really driven by open data principles, and that window is closing. So I'm not sure we still have enough time for trying out our little thing each in our own garden. So what should we do? Use only one engine, of course. I'm joking. I'm of course not promoting that. I mean, that would work, but there are also good reasons for having different engines, and also it's just not realistic. People will always want to have their own way of doing things, which is fine. However, I'm sure we could work a lot more on interoperability. There are at least 3 aspects that I would really like us as a community to focus on. One is legal references. What I mean by that is, how do you associate a rule that has been coded to its original legal reference, right? Usually there's a text that's in most jurisdictions available online. Some jurisdictions, even the very rich ones, do not necessarily publish their legislation, which always is fascinating for someone coming from a European background, that you can have legislation that is not publicly available, but it does happen. So no matter whether it's public or not, there should be a way to uniquely and unambiguously identify legal references and be able to say, this formula has been coded because of this article and this paragraph in this specific code at this point in time. And right now, we still don't have a unified way, uniform way to have the legal references. So even if we might be using different engines, even if there might be divergence, we should not have to learn a new way to point at the original legislation. This is a basic of rules as code. And there are existing open standard formats for such legal references. Another point that I believe we should be focusing on is entities definition. So the screenshot you have here is from the definition of a person in OpenFisca. What I mean by entities is who are the forms of entities subject to legislation. Just like we should be able to pinpoint one specific area of legislation, we should also be able to have a common definition of who is subject to the rules, right? What is a person? What's a company? What's a household? And all this and so forth, right? There are many of those. And of course, from one country to the next, who's subject to tax might not be the same. In France, for example, for the French system, households are responsible for income revenue tax, whereas in most countries, there's been individualization, and it's only a person who's responsible for their income revenue tax. And it's fine that there are different implementations. It's fine that there are different subjects, but we should have the same definition of what that subject is. This is very important for international comparison, to understand who is on what the legislation is applicable. We should definitely create an open ontology for entities. And once more, there are several that already exist, because we're not the first ones to think, hey, we should have a common definition for company and person. But this should be implemented straight within the rules as code engines. And finally, parameters of the legislation. So while the formulas, really how you assemble, how you make the computation, this will differ from one engine to the next. However, legislation always have something that we call parameters in OpenFisca, which is some values that change over time, like the percentage of something, like an amount in a specific currency or whatever. There's always a date at which some value takes some amount, some property takes some value. And having this is maybe 1/2 of the value that there is in the rules as code model. The other half is all the rest of the modeling, but this is completely redundant. It's all about extracting values that have changed over time as legislation evolves. And I don't believe that there can be much added value in having different formats from one engine to the other. So having one open standard format for parameters that would enable at least mutualizing this knowledge, because what do we gain from having 3 different teams that each do the same extraction work in their own language? We don't gain anything. We just lose a lot of steam and energy. So I believe that interoperability should also focus on parameters. But who can create and promote such standards? So the example format you see here for parameters is from OpenFisca. I believe it's quite a good one. So for example, that part could be done by the OpenFisca Association. But as I said, it was officially created 2 months ago. It's great. And its purpose is to guarantee the global free and permanent access and contribution to its software suite, its collaborative processes, and its models. So as part of that mission, it could do its work in promoting such a standard. But it also has another goal, which is to increase the number of jurisdictions with an OpenFisca model, which is perfectly meaningful for that association. And to that end, we, for example, advocate for OpenFisca to be used as a shared engine in the European Union. And this would enable the sort of collaboration that we're talking about. But while I believe that this specific engine has a very good format for parameters, for example, it does not provide this unified legislative reference format that I was mentioning earlier, at least yet. Hopefully it will. And anyways, we shouldn't be the only ones to edict such standards, because if we want them to be standards, they should be shared by everyone in the community. So in order to preserve that innovation capability of the ecosystem while decreasing the negative impacts of fragmentation, we should probably have a way to collaborate. So who should do it? Maybe it's time to have a rules as code foundation, one that's a bit further away from any specific implementation, one that could handle standards writing, one that could handle some of the advocacy for the concept of rules as code, and not leave it to individual implementers to push for their own implementation. Because at some point, when you are in a competing environment, you might have to push your own solution against the others. And then you're not anymore advocating for rules as code globally. You're saying, my way of doing rules as code is better than the others, right? But we're not at the stage where rules as code is a given. We're at the stage where we have still to convince many, many actors of the importance of rules as code. So this advocacy, I think, would be much better handled in a shared way. And that's also what we do within the OpenFisca Association. If you look at our framework for action, of course, first and foremost, we want to maintain OpenFisca and make it available globally. But amongst the things that we task ourselves with is also advocating for the principles themselves, rules as code, digital commons, transparency. So we want to go beyond. But honestly, having an organization whose only responsibility would be to do so would be very meaningful. And beyond rules as code, just defending the principles of openness. Rules as code has very deeply ingrained this notion of transparency. I've mentioned how open data is kind of losing steam. Open source, I think, is still okay, but we see also a lot of predation from proprietary actors. So we really need to keep on reinforcing these ideas of transparency, open source, open collaboration, open data, and having an entity that would be dedicated to those completely independently from any specific implementation, but reminding that this is critical for democratic involvement in society would be very relevant. Thanks for your attention, and I'm here to open this discussion and answer any questions.
That was great, Matti. Thank you. Awesome. Alfred's already jumping in, so I won't say any more. Go for it, Alfred.
Well, firstly, I think excellent, very well articulated, very well presented, Matti. And it's funny because as you were speaking, I had one question I was writing in the middle before you answered at the very end, and that was like, great, open standards, interoperability. You know, is there a leading body pioneering or trailblazing these interoperable standards? And you answered the question implicitly saying no, but we ideally would form such a foundation with members of all rules as code engines and other interested members to come together to help form these and comply and have all their respective systems comply with, because I suspect that's how you create the movement and for the standards to stick and therefore sustain. So I think it's brilliant. I guess now the follow-up question I have for you is, are there, like, how do you go about forming that? Like, you know, is it just a matter of what you're doing, creating awareness, talking to other leaders of other rules as code engines to come together to propose this idea? Well, like, what's the next steps to realize this vision?
I mean, yeah, I think it starts with talking about it
Yeah,
in
right.
a space like this one. So I think you're seeing some of my strategy here. But yeah, so 2 points. First, I think I want to address the question that you did not ask, which is what would be the standards body? There are many standardization bodies, actually. And so establishing a foundation that's topical as opposed to going to the existing standards body is honestly a choice. We could very well say, you know what, now we're going to go with ISO and go through the whole standardization process. So this is also definitely a venue that's possible, but still, and okay, let me be candid about the strategy. First, we need to have the critical mass of actors assembled. Now, whether this ends up in creating a foundation or whether this ends up opening a stream in ISO, we will figure this out in 1 year or 2 years. But first, we need to get the people there, right? And maybe the foundation would exist, but be very tiny and just be a way to open the standard at ISO or at IEEE. There are different options for standardization. But my experience with these bodies is that they are heavily bureaucratic, which is also a feature of the system because you don't want the standard to change every second week, right? So it would make sense to put up the proposal when we already kind of have some degree of, if not adoption, at least agreement.
Critical mass.
With the community. Otherwise, it will be too early. And if I start this as the OpenFisca Association, most likely it will be seen as a tentative takeover, wherein it's not. So we first need to get this team going, this agreement, and then we can see what's the best way to actually do the standardization. Maybe we decide that for a year or two, we just try to adopt in at least 2 different implementations, and then we will go to ISO, or not, I don't know. But yeah, of course, it makes sense at some point to go to and get an official stamp, especially for software that's intended to be used in governments. This would be really good.
Yes.
But first we need to get people together. And so the next step, I believe, is getting more interest. One of the main difficulties that we encounter is the one that I was mentioning at the very beginning of this presentation in the fragmentation. It's that, I mean, let's be realistic. Currently, most rules as code initiatives are very small scale, handled by small teams with very uncertain funding. I feel legitimate to open this question now because we have incorporated as an association. We have members. We're getting towards recurring funding. We're not yet at a scale where we can handle a lot of technical work, but at least we're able to put forward this sort of proposal to push this word because we represent a few hundred of people now. But there are not many other actors who have the same level. Talking about standardization with actors who have half a user, that's not even in production, but that's still a prototype after 2 years, it's kind of difficult because the cost for us to change the way we implement things is impacting 10 different countries and many systems in production. So there will be this difficulty of finding people who are willing to collaborate on this, but also are kind of at a similar level of adoption and how it costs to them to update their implementation.
Yes, it's a tricky position. I understand. Yeah.
Do you have a follow-up question, Alfred?
There was more of a smaller one, just out of curiosity about, you know, the French government supporting 3. Are you comfortable naming what the other 2 are? Are they open source? Are they proprietary?
No, they are open source.
Okay.
So I'm talking about Publicode and Catala,
right?
Which are so Publicode is used in production in 1 ministry, as far as I know, maybe two ministries.
Yep.
And Catala is an entire language, and it is used, I think, as a prototype in 1 ministry. Yeah, that's it. But there's funding and there's support from some agencies there.
Sure.
Whereas OpenFisca is adopted in at least 6 different ministries and is used by the parliament for modeling legislation ahead of its implementation. So it's great that there are different approaches, but sometimes it's also a bit confusing to explain that a government is still trying different options. But that's just a matter of just how far you look at it, because the state is not monolithic, right? The state per se does not really exist. Each agency, each country, each ministry does their own thing, and often we see an ideal version of rules as code with one unique implementation, but we don't realize that currently in most countries where there's no direct rules as code approach, each current silo has their own implementation of something that's not even public, that's not even clear what it is, that's completely outsourced. So it's already much better.
Sure. Yeah, there's always that tension, right, between fragmentation, but also, you know, competition promotes innovation, pushing boundaries, and all. It's which is a good thing. And so, yeah, and hence the interoperability is the answer to this, as you've beautifully articulated. So yeah, cool.
Thanks, Alfred. Does anybody else have any questions? Otherwise, I will jump in with a couple.
You go first, Joe. I did want to talk a little bit about DocRef, but I'll come back to that. You go first.
Cool, awesome. Thanks, Philippa. So first question is around that reach and finding a critical mass. So obviously OpenFisca is just one of the parties involved, but has some reach already. I just wondered whether there are other organizations, international organizations, the UN, for example, who definitely interested in the international rule of law, who might be advocates and helpful conveners. I don't know, Matti, is that something that you've looked at, people that you've spoken to, outside and above the governments and the agencies like SALSA who are working on this?
Yes, thank you for the question. So there are the international institutions that progressively support rules as code have been the OECD, especially through the OPSI Cracking the Rules report that came out in 2020. Most people here know about. So they've been advocating for rules as code since then, and recommending OpenFisca for the last 4 years as a way to prototype. We see a growing interest in the OECD for that, especially since last year, led by Sweden. So what that means is that this is an arena where countries can have their delegates and decide that maybe they want to work on a prototype individually or together and reconvene at a later stage to talk about the outcomes. But this is still not a wide policy adoption, right? So this is more about, hey, you should try this out because we find it's really relevant. And this year, as was announced at the OpenFisca launch event, I'm very proud to share that the G7 will also have recommendations to attend. So until the official G7 summit, and we cannot know what exactly will be the degree of adoption by the states, but at least we have put forward a proposal for rules as code that has been strongly supported by the Think 7, so the G7 internal think tank that has put forward this position paper that you can find online. And that is advocating for that. So we definitely hope to have this supported by G7. You mentioned the United Nations. We're not at this stage yet. The UN as an institution is such high level that it will probably not take a position on such an implementation. If it ever does something like this, it will be in very, very vague terms. The higher level you go and the more vague it becomes. So it might potentially encourage countries to leverage digital solutions for better citizen involvement in rules and international comparison. Now, up to you to figure out what that means. So yeah, we probably won't have that. But there are some United Nations agencies that might be more supportive, but for that we need to be very topical, because that's how the UN works. Each agency is focused on one policy area, and so we might talk with some of them. And we've seen, of course, most of the interest and adoption being driven on the economical areas. So maybe other institutions such as the World Bank or the International Monetary Fund might also be interested. We've been talking with the World Bank a few times in the last years. So they are aware of the existence of such tools. We've also been talking with the Inter-American Bank for Development, for example. So they are definitely such institutions. But yeah, it does take a lot of time. Another one, of course, which is still regional, but should be considered an international institution, is the European Union, which is also supporting this. But where this is really tricky is that in the end, what gets muddled are national rules. And so international institutions are very wary with being too prescriptive as to what countries should adopt for modeling their own legislation. And it's for good reasons, right? You wouldn't want someone to come over and say, hey, now you're going to use this standard because we decided for you that it's better. And it actually might influence the way you envision your own legislation.
However, international trade requires interoperability of nation states, right? Generally, unless you're trying to do what some people are trying to do at the moment, right? So, yeah, the standards are still an international concern potentially to ease the trade between nations, right?
Yes, absolutely. Yes, and that's why I was mentioning in this presentation the relevance of interoperability, especially for international aspects. So I do believe that we probably the best way forward. I mean, one of the ways forward would be to have an international cooperation dedicated to international trade or some specific policy area like that. And we're having talks with some partners to that end, precisely to model not the internal legislation, but more what's at the boundary. But then what makes it a bit difficult is that you need to find partners on both sides of that,
yes.
of that board.
Of course, yes. So my second question is of a similar nature and hopefully leading on from that. So rules as code, the rules themselves are a primitive for other pieces of technology, right? So for instance, I'm involved with the Cardano community, which is a international community that is working on various different protocols that create operating standards for trade across boundaries using an alternative currency. But there are lots of rules that are locked into those smart contracts, and generally they need to refer to jurisdictional rules as well. So my question, following on from the last one, is not just those creating a foundation that includes not just those knowns like the UN, the World Bank, etc., but also some of those new organizations, global organizations that are very much into computational trade, smart contracts, etc. Where does that sit in the plans for either OpenFisca or the foundation?
That's not in ours so far, and I'm not aware of such initiatives.
Something to explore then, Matti.
Possibly. It's just that the interaction between the blockchain technologies and the state have not been conclusive in most cases. And while I think there are definitely many interesting aspects to blockchains and smart contracts, I'm not sure I would want to be in the situation where I try to advocate for such technologies in a meeting with the tax ministries of most countries, especially when I'm already trying to advocate for rules as code. So I think that coalescing the two might not be the most beneficial step forward for driving adoption of the concept.
Philippa, do you want to jump in?
Thanks. Yeah, thanks for that, Matti. Really enjoyed that. And I was going to say, when you were talking about the policy briefing, I recently read that and it's really good. So, Joe, I'm sure you'd enjoy it, and anyone else here as well, of course. My question was, when you're talking about standards in terms of referencing the legislation, do you see a tool like DocRef having a role to play in creating, although then again it would tie to everyone having to go with the same technology and use the technology for standardization rather than, perhaps doing it through ISO or something? But how do you think that might fit in, if at all?
Yeah. So let's first clarify two things. Like going through ISO and establishing the standard, I think, are two different things. So what you would have with going through an international standards organization is formalizing the process and establishing a unambiguous reference, but that does not mean that ISO would establish the standard itself, right? They would establish the process around it, make sure that parties are involved, clarify what it means that the standard is at this level of maturity, something like this. So the two are not one or the other. You might very well say, hey, now we want to push DocRef as an ISO standard, and these are two independent tracks. So that's for how it will articulate with ISO. Now, specifically to DocRef. DocRef is this initiative by, I think now it's pushed owned officially by Syncopate Lab. Previously known as the Love Letter format by Hamish Fraser, who's a good friend and working in New Zealand. I was hoping to have him here today. And yeah, I voluntarily did not mention DocRef in the legal reference standard part, even though it was, do you say this in English? In French, we say burning my lips. I really wanted to say it. I've been an advocate for Love Letter, the Love Letter format, but DocRef has one very big issue, which is not that it has changed technically in any way, but it's not open source at this stage. And I cannot advocate for some standard that is not open source. Sorry for that. So we still have a plan to have a discussion with Hamish about that, because I really wish that it becomes open again, that we can work on it. But as I tried to explain, I have to suspend now every potential inclusion of DocRef in OpenFisca and other open source software. We cannot rely on a standard that is not commonly owned. That's not possible. So there's this tension here, and I'm sure we will solve it. But otherwise, since now we've named one, have to name the other. I think the most likely, and then to my knowledge, the only open standard that would be operational for legal references at this stage would be ELI, the European Legislation Identifier. And even though it has European in its name, it can be used in any jurisdiction. It's just a URI standard that defines how to articulate. And DocRef is better at this stage because it goes to internal documents, to infra-document legal references. So you can really go down to the level of one list item, one paragraph, whereas ELI is only at document level at this stage. However, I have to say that they keep on working on the ELI standard, and it is on their roadmap to go to infra-document level, and that they have currently adoption in EU 27 plus other countries at different levels of depth. So yeah, DocRef is definitely interesting, but needs to take a stance as to whether it intends to be this open standard, and if so, it has to be open. It cannot just be a standard.
Matti, let me help you here. Hamish, if you're listening, DocRef open source ×2.
×3.
×3, there you go. Pressure's on, Hamish. Yeah. But no, there's always that tension, isn't there, with open source, commercial sustainability. It's lots of things to consider with these things, and the ROI and the investment you make, and if giving away the IP too early, it's always that tension that we all grapple with.
Absolutely, and then, I mean, yes, there's been a lot of work in there, and it also makes sense that there's a need to get some funding associated for it. Exactly. I know firsthand.
Yes, you do.
How hard it is to get funds for something that's purely open source and fully available. And yeah, it is very hard, and it's honestly, I think, something that can only be done in the long run. And most of us, unfortunately, don't have the luxury of waiting for the long run when we're not backed financially by third parties. So it makes all sense. I still believe, and this is a discussion that I really want to have, and that we had planned to have with the DocRef owners, as to which part exactly should be open and which one may not. I believe that the standard itself, I mean, if we want it to be a standard, it has to be open. There's no way around it. But then there are many offerings that might be developed around it. But once more, I mean, this is just the idea. And then again, when you're the one operating the thing and you've invested a lot of effort in it, you kind of have to make your own decisions. So this is perfectly understandable. And I mean, if the ELI could go that far, it's because it's backed by the European Union. There's a team that's paid to make this work and then drive the international adoption. So there's also a reason why these things can be kept open, is because somebody's paying for it, and in this case, it's the European taxpayer who's paying for that standard.
Are there figures on the cost of the fragmentation that's happened at the moment? So the potential wastage that has occurred over, I don't know, however many years, where these other models have popped up. Do you have some numbers to put around that? No.
No, not at all. I mean, for that, I mean, there would be a methodology to be established, and then we would need to collect data that's often will be business private data as to how much has been invested.
Right,
all this.
yeah, of course.
So yeah, you're right. Maybe at some point we need to do the advocacy in that end. But then again, who would we lobby with these numbers? I'm not sure exactly. I hope that it will be sufficient to try and get more awareness from the community, so that we don't have to focus on the losses, but rather on the potential gains that we would have together as a community if there was a bit less fragmentation, or at least more interoperability.
Speaking of which, so are there numbers in that direction? The potential for every dollar invested in rules as code. We've had a guest on the RaC Guild before, Tim, I think, who was one of the first guests right at the very beginning, who did some work around some use cases to determine some kind of benefit cost benefit analysis, and model that might be useful.
I mean, I would refer you to the OECD and G7 bibliography on that. That shows that. There's also been a report to the Australian government, which I think still has not been fully opened as for its methodology. But there's a blog post. Alfred, do you remember maybe the name of the article? Because anyways, so there's an article for the French government, of the Australian government, sorry, and I think it was published on the Mandarin as well.
Oh,
okay,
yeah,
nice.
the one by Tim, exactly, the one by Tim de Souza. So he was certainly talking about it in that part. I think, to my knowledge, this is the one that went deepest in the benefits assessment, like the value per dollar that you get out of this. But this is for one jurisdiction, and then there's the more qualitative approach and some quotes that have been assembled by the G7 and OECD papers.
Awesome. Thanks, Philippa, for the link.
Oh, you beat me to it. I found
that's not to the one Matti was just talking about. That's to the one Matti was talking about before.
Ah, right. Yeah, this last one was I think the Mandarin reference.
Yes.
Yeah.
That was that's not the Tim de Souza one though, or it is?
This one is a Tim de Souza, but there's a couple he's done. He's done this one, but also I'm not sure if the OECD made reference to this one or a separate piece of work that he did. Yeah.
Perfect.
So how can we help, Matti? Obviously, we're all passionate rules as code people here. What can we do? What do you need?
Well, you've already helped a lot by giving me this stage to put forward this, if not formal proposal, at least to start raising some awareness, and we'll see then how other community members feel towards that. I see that, or at least for the audience here, there seems to resonate. So we'll see where that goes next. I don't know what role the rules as Code Guild would like to play in such a foundation. If there's also interest in maybe at some point growing up a bit in this and maybe establishing this not only town hall for monthly sharing, but maybe also a more perennial space for discussions at a more operational level. That might also be a way in which there could be some help. But yeah, I think most of all it has to do with advocating for this, and maybe realizing and reinforcing this idea that there is something bigger to rules as code than just the engines that we're building, and that we should really keep in mind the importance of the open and democratic principles that underpin it. And I hope that there's a growing shared realization that, at least from my perspective, there's a growing sense of urgency that this window of opportunity is starting to close, and that it's time maybe to be a bit more mature as a community, and do maybe a bit less of experimentation and a bit more of deployment. It's a time for us to grow and to stand up for this before this all gets handed down to the dodges of this world, who will be more than happy to just make more institutions unsustainable on their own, and that we end up in a world where legislation is modeled not by the legislative bodies, but by those who own the ability to transform it into code, and that takes away power away from the people and the citizens it's supposed to represent.
Your message resonates with lots of other communities that we are connected to. So there are many opportunities to take this video among others, and share it into other spaces, along with some information about the OpenFisca Association as well. Does anybody have any other, or final comments or questions for Matti? No?
Just a thank you again for the all the information and the presentation. It's good stuff, mate.
Thank you very much.
Excellent, Matti. So thank you for coming this evening, everybody. Next Rules as Code Guild meeting will be our first birthday. It will be number 12. So please do join us on the first Wednesday of June for the next RaC Guild event. There will be an invite coming out to you. If you're registered, you will be able to find a recording of this evening's presentation from Matti on the website, which is racguild.org, so that you can share it with your networks. And we look forward to seeing you again. And finally, thanks again, Matti, for putting together the presentation for this evening. It was really good. And onwards and upwards.
Thanks, Matti.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. Have a good evening.
Thanks
all.
everyone.
All right, see you
Bye.
later. Thank you. Ciao.
Bye.
Thank you.